Hello, everybody. We have so much to cover today. It is going to blow your mind. So buckle up as we cover chapter 12, which is about organizing a paper. But remember, you don't actually have to do a paper. We're going to organize a presentation in some ways very similar to a paper, but many of the same concepts will still apply. We're going to talk about thesis statements. We're going to talk about outlines. And we're going to talk about credible sources, especially the difference between primary and secondary, and a couple other things to hash out. It's pretty dense. It's very thick stuff to get through. And most of it is near and dear to my heart because I once upon a time in at least two of these topics, including statistics and thesis statements, and each of those got a 5-credit C the first time I tried to hack into them. So don't worry about it that much. This is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just so you can suss out the basic differences between a good thesis statement, a bad thesis statement, a good source and a bad source, a good outline and a bad outline. So take a deep breath. Let's tackle just the tip of this iceberg and dive right in there. I'm confident you can do it. I've seen your writing all semester long. I think you can all find a solid thesis statement. So, what is a thesis statement and how does it relate to your project, your video recording, your mini lecture that you'll give us? A thesis statement is your main argument. And again, this doesn't have to be argumentative so much as it has to declare its slant. Everything has a slant. So few things in this world are actually objective. They're virtually impossible to find. So the more valid, reliable way of presenting information is to declare one's slant. Another way of talking about a thesis statement that becomes useful for presentations can be that your main point, it's your topic, the opinion, objective, idea, concept, assertion, perspective, philosophy, pronouncement, the narrative, the skew, the bent, the bias, the proposal, the theory, the postulate, the principle, the conclusion, or the hypothesis. So this is to say, these are all things, all kinds of statements that are basically synonyms of thesis statement that all imply that we very carefully have to spell out something that we can then make very clear. I here have a favorite rave about thesis statements. The reason that I got a 5-credit C when I tried an honors class that involved strong thesis statements is because they are so important. It will take the level of your communication and writing and leadership and understanding of science and studies to the next level as soon as you can pinpoint a thesis statement. And even two places using the same source for information can have different thesis statements. So pause me now and go read my rave that I have about thesis statements and why they're so important. It really is part of how you become an expert in your field, is when you can notice the thesis behind everything, and when you can begin declaring your own thesis statement. It really takes you from an initiate of college to an employer level of understanding of almost any material in almost any field. So please go read my rave and come right back. And on a practical level, not on the level of you want to blow everyone's minds with your amazing communication, but on a really practical level, if you don't have a thesis statement, it tends to imply that you're saying, right? If you can't declare what it is that you're really saying, it's a direct relationship to not, in fact, having narrowed down what you're trying to say. And if you don't know what you're trying to say, it can mean a couple things. It can mean that your paper or your presentation or your meeting notes or anything are too scattered. They're not organized, that it bounces all over the place, and you can't figure out what is actually a main point, and that it just zigs and zags with no clear path. Something else that can happen if there's no thesis statement, or if you don't know your thesis statement, can sometimes mean that there isn't one. That everything in that scattered pattern isn't actually related. And, you know, if you reform something like that, if you take something that doesn't really have a thesis statement and you dig for one and you reorganize based on what you found, you can get rid of that disorganization and you'll actually have something to say instead of just like playing connect the dots. Instead of just having dots on your presentation or your paper or your meeting notes, once you organize it, once you know your thesis statement, then it becomes the connected dots. That's what the thesis statement and the outline and the sources are going to help you do, is to go from dots everywhere to an actual connect the dot picture where you can recognize a whole that makes sense. Something else that can happen if you don't know your thesis is that you won't be disclosing enough information. That if you didn't realize that what you were actually arguing is that cheetahs are faster than tigers, and you were just giving a bunch of random information about cheetahs and tigers, you may not be disclosing who studied the speed of each of these animals, and it could imply that you're not revealing your sources. Above and beyond that, not having a solid thesis statement could mean that you have sketchy sources or no sources at all. If you can't find an argument, a point, followed by support, maybe you don't have any sources, maybe you don't have enough, or maybe they're really crappy sources that didn't give you enough information to highlight a good thesis statement. So this is why professors and employers and journalists and really literate scientific journal consumers hit so hard on a thesis statement or a hypothesis, is because we can all tell when there's gibberish and jargon happening that doesn't make a cohesive whole. And part of how that happens is either that the information is too scattershot and can't be narrowed down, so the thesis statement turns out to not be great, or that the thesis statement is not great and thus you can't find any support for it. And we'll see straight through it. I guarantee you, anyone in a high position with communications knows how to look for organization, including a thesis statement that is one of the signals that you actually know what you're talking about and that you can back it up. So in the book, some things that they highlight as ways to recognize a good thesis statement, a good argument, a good main point, are 4 things. One is to make it specific and concrete. If you only have a certain number of minutes in a presentation or pages in a paper, you may not want to take on a giant, big, general topic like everything you need to know about the large cats of the savannah. It wouldn't work. It would be much more specific and concrete to contrast 2 of them, for example. It's part of why contrasting is such a popular style of presenting or writing, is that it takes it and makes it really specific and concrete. Cheetahs are faster than tigers. You're not comparing necessarily their diets, you're not necessarily comparing their coats, you're comparing speed of 2 very specific cats. And as soon as you make it concrete and specific like that and have narrowed it down just about as far as you can, then you'll have something really solid to present. You'll be able to find really great sources, you will be able to organize it really smoothly, and you'll know what you're talking about, and that will show in your thesis statement and your presentation or paper. And a strong thesis statement or hypothesis is declarative. It says something. This is the way it is. And this is the part that can feel a little bit argumentative. But it's not that you're viciously pointing your finger in someone else's face and saying, this is how it is. It's actually just you becoming an expert, that you've been to college now and you know how to say, this is what's true and here's the support, right? So a thesis statement, a good one, isn't a question, it's an answer. You can ask yourself a question about your presentation or your paper or your research, but your thesis statement needs to be the answer. It is not the question itself, it is the answer that you discover while making your assertions and doing your research. It is declarative, it asserts something. And it needs to be relatively concise. You can't have an entire paragraph of thesis statement. You have to be able to do it in a sentence. And the sentence should not be run on and should not go forever. If you find that your sentence, your thesis statement, your hypothesis can't be concise, something's gone wrong. You need to reevaluate what your thesis statement really should be, and if you're trying to include too much information, if you don't have enough information, if you didn't find enough sources, time to shift your thesis statement to something you can support. Because if you can't do it concisely, something's gone wrong. You've bitten off more than you can chew, or you don't have enough sources and you're rambling. So if you can't make it specific and concrete, declarative and certain, or concise, check your sources, check and see what it really is you're trying to say. And then the other thing is that it needs to be truthful and well cited. And we will talk about this with the sources. But basically it means that if you have a thesis statement that you can't find sources for, you gotta abandon it. Abandon it and pick something else for which you do have sources. It doesn't mean it can't be similar, it doesn't mean it can't be related. But if you have made a tentative thesis statement and then you realize that either the sources are flawed or you don't have any, or that you have too many and you need to narrow it down even further in perspective, then in order to stay well-cited and truthful, you'll have to shift your thesis statement to follow what you've actually discovered. There is also a handout of bad and better thesis statements that basically compare these 4 factors. I've attached it here for you as a PDF. And it will give you 4 examples for each concept. One that's not great and why, one that's also not great for a different reason, and then 2 that are okay. I would argue that these aren't perfect either, but it's a great place to start because you can see these examples of what a professor would look at with your paper, what an employer would look at with your proposal, if it's specific enough, if it's concrete enough, if it's declarative, and if it's truthful, right? So in this bad and better thesis statements, it usually compares these 4 factors. It's basically looking for specificity, that it's certain and declarative, that it's concise, and that it's truthful and well cited. So pause and take a look at this. The bad, better, and non-thesis statements. They have one that's too broad. They have one that doesn't really say anything, meaning maybe they didn't find any sources, or maybe they found too many sources, and either way, didn't narrow far enough, or didn't follow the materials themselves. An uncontestable thesis is a problem. If you say, what's a good one? I wish you were actually in the room and could shout out a theory that isn't disprovable. Anything that can't be disproved is not a hypothesis you should make in an experiment, nor is it something you should put as your thesis statement. Everything I can come up with right now is disputable, even things like, my mom loves me best of all the other children, right? Like, you could prove that. That's disprovable. If you couldn't get your mom on record saying she loved you best, it's disprovable. So I'm having a hard time thinking of one right now, but don't do anything that can't be disproved, because that means it also can't be proved, if that makes any sense. Don't make it a list. You can include several factors. You can say, I am the most popular sibling due to these 3 factors: cleanliness of room, groceries contributed to the refrigerator, and amount of gas contributed to the cars, right? Those are 3 factors that are not just a list, right? So you're arguing something. You're saying, I am the best sibling because, and you give 3 specific measures. If you listed just those 3 specific measures with no point, it wouldn't count as a thesis. You can't just say, I contribute groceries, gas, and a clean living space. I mean, it's not really saying anything. It's lacking thesis statement. It's just a list of things. There's no slant. You would need to say some outcome, some how or why. Yep. And so even if it's for primary research, and we'll talk about this more for primary sources, you still get to declare something. I know that it feels a bit tentative sometimes, especially without a master's, without a PhD. What do you mean I'm doing original research? Well, even if you're arguing that Birkenstocks are the best sandals, you get to crown yourself the expert on this and prove your points with amazing sources. That's part of why a good thesis statement has to be assertive, is because you are now becoming a communication and in your field expert, which means that you need to get comfortable putting forth something new and genuine and then proving it through sources that only you have thus far compiled, if that makes any sense. And then once you have a really great thesis statement, even if you have to revise it later because you find out something different in your sources, remember that happened to me in the brainstorm with Fred Smith. But once you tentatively have a strong thesis statement, it gives you a trajectory of what you need to follow, of what you need to find, right? Once you put the thesis statement, cheetahs are faster than tigers, that immediately sends you on a path of where to look for information and what kind of information you need. You know that you're not looking for information about rabbits. You know you're not looking for information on pumas or bobcats. No, it rules out so many things and points you directly at what you need to go follow, source-wise. So the thesis statement of your paper or presentation turns out to be the point of the whole paper, and then the whole body of the paper or speech or presentation turns out to be the support. And the thesis statement lays out what the point of each paragraph, even when you're speaking, which each point in your outline for a speech or presentation should be as subpoints. So the point of your paper is supported by the body. The subpoints, like of each paragraph, even spoken, are a trajectory that follows from your effective thesis statement. And then inside each paragraph, even spoken, they will have a point and support. So that an outline can flow from your thesis statement with point, support, 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 support. We're going to go meta again. And inside each of those subpoints, each of those supports for your thesis, they each have to have a point, and the paragraph, whatever else you're saying on that subtopic, needs to be the support for those little mini thesis statements. So there's lots of point and support here. There's the meta level of point and support of the thesis statement, supported by the entire rest of the presentation. And then inside of each subpoint, which will be your outline, you'll have these little subtopics and subpoints that are support for the main point of each paragraph. And it sounds like a lot when we talk about it, but you won't actually find it that hard. Once you have a brainstorm, really what turns it into an outline is deciding a sensical order to put things and deciding what's support and what is the umbrella. What is the umbrella that goes over the support that is held up by the support? So the point is the thesis statement and the rest of the paper is support. and within the general body support of a presentation or a paper, those paragraphs each have a point and they support each other. Let's cover this a little further. Sometimes you can look at your brainstorm and decide an order. You can either copy and paste if you like to type your brainstorms, or you can start numbering and drawing arrows and stars on your brainstorm sheet of paper so that the next draft you make will have a correct order. And there are a couple of ways that you can do this. You can do it chronologically. If you're doing something that really happened, an event or a historical person, or any kind of process that covers more than an instant, you can do it chronologically. What happens in this process first? What happened in the story or narrative first? Which person affected the outcome first? You can do it chronologically in the order that it time-wise happened. Something else you can do is by topic, right? So if you're going to talk about a historical event, you can do it by not just chronology, you could do it by person. If you want to compare how two figures in history experience the same event, you can cover it first by person A and then by person B, right? Instead of saying, this is what happened in 1969, this is what happened in 1970, this is what happened in 1971, which would be chronological, you could do it topically by person and say, this is what person A did 1969 through 1971. This is what person B did 1969 through 1971. The same works for vehicles or theory, that you could cover the evolution of two competing vehicles in a market. You could say, instead of, this is what happened to the car market in 1969 or 1970 or 1971, you could instead say, this is what VW was doing in 69, 70, and 71. This is what Ford was doing in 69, 70, and 71. So do you see how you'd cover it topically differently? You can also do it by quality, which means that if you didn't want to cover all of history at once chronologically, and then if it even was too much to cover all of VW or all of Ford at one time, you could then break it down by qualities inside. You could pick out design, you could pick out price point, you could pick out internal engine factors and engineering, and you could cover those topics and contrast VW's interior design versus Ford's interior design for that entire span, so that you wouldn't be covering it just by order of events. You wouldn't be covering it just by topic. You'd be qualitatively listing the subpoints and covering them together. And you just have to decide what works best for your topic. And as we proceed through the next couple weeks, as you submit things, I'll help you do this, right? I may say something like, well, I feel like maybe if you're going to compare X and Y, you might want to cover it by each of their A, B, C's instead of trying to span 2 decades. Or if you're doing Birkenstocks, you may want to describe all of the arch support before you move on to describing all of the lashings across the top, right? So pick which organization style works best for your topic: chronological, topical, or quality-based. There are others. Feel free to Google. Something that can really help make an outline for a paper or presentation is practicing again what the points and supports really are. Sometimes when you do the points and supports, it will start to lay out for you what your organization has to be. And I have a handout that seems, a little bit basic, but it's really helpful. And when I get stuck in a brainstorm or organizational process for anything, I try to make it as simple as possible and go back to the point and support. And sometimes it tells me what an order has to be. If it's instructional, for example, if you're trying to tell someone how to build a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, first you have to list ingredients and you have to get bread. And just by doing the points and supports, it makes very clear what order the steps have to be, what the organizational scheme has to be. So this handout that has a table on it is a little bit basic, but it can be super helpful to take all the thoughts running around in your head and pretend that they are one of these paragraphs. Pretend that this is the bulk of information that you have trapped in your brain, and watch how you yourself take a paragraph and find the points versus supports. And once you can start to do it for these paragraphs, you can start to do it for your original ideas and find what is the point and support and what would the sensical order be. Something else that helps for outlines is that it doesn't have to be super formal for this class. There are super formal outlines available. There's MLA, there's APA, there's Chicago. All of these are styles of outlines that can be very formal, and they dictate which numeral and letter and number and subpoint has to go where. But you can, for this class, feel free to make your own version that maybe differentiates just between bolding and indentation, or some italics or some bullet points. I don't need you to do Roman numeral 1 and then the letter A and then subpoints 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It can be really useful, and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Try those for organizing. They can be really helpful, but if it's more helpful to you to put your thesis in italics and label it, and then to just drop down a line and make it bold, do some tabbing to indent the subpoints, that's okay. And some of these handouts that I will attach can help you make an outline like that. They give you plenty of background information on how to make an outline, and then they give you some with specifics, like this one I think takes a kid's report on Obama, fitting for this week, and breaks it down into an actual point and support outline with Obama, like specifically, and details all actually oriented at that topic. And then they also give you this, which is a much more generalized look, and that would be just fine for this class, to have a main topic and thesis statement, and then to have your organized subpoints. And again, you're not actually going to have to write a paper about this. This is to help make sure that your talking points for your mini lecture are in order. Before we can get you out of fight or flight, one of the easiest things we can do is make you feel prepared and organized. And it'll take a lot of the panic out of the process if your information is just ready for you to just check off as you talk about it. Okay, so no real paper, just some bullet points, so that you can very clearly conceptualize and show the difference between your main point and your subpoints and all of their support. You're basically just deciding what is the umbrella over all of this, and what are the little mini umbrellas that are over each point, and what is the support that follows underneath. There is a more formal one that, if it is super useful to you, shows a little bit of the more formal outline. So feel free to use those. Sometimes if I really want to suss out the details of what I'm saying, go super formal. It's not always harder. Sometimes it makes your life easier to use really formal organization. So suss it out, see what works best for your topic. Point and support, organize it. Which brings us to support. We can't have an amazing presentation without resources, without sources that are high quality. You would never want to go into a meeting with a boss of any variety, and certainly not with a professor or a research facility, and not have read the source material. And when it comes to speeches and presentations and drafts and proposals and research papers, those sometimes have to be more formal. So even though you don't have to write a whole research paper, you're going to have a bibliography of sources used in MLA format, just like you're doing a research paper. You don't have to write the paper, but you're going to list the sources that show and back up all these points in organization that give something a really strong presence that would work for an employer, that would work at upper levels of writing or research or study. Okay, so the first thing that we need to know about source material is if a source is primary. Primary means straight from the horse's mouth. It's not from the veterinarian looking at the horse's mouth and telling you what's in there. It's not from the previous owner of the horse telling you what's in the horse's mouth. It's not from someone standing up on the porch far away from the barn guessing about what's in the horse's mouth. It is, in this example, literally opening up the horse's mouth and looking in there. This looks different for every other field. Every field does this a little bit differently. Health sciences do it a little bit different from psychology. Psychology does it a little bit different from biology. Biology does it a little bit differently from mathematics. But there are some general guidelines that you can follow. So here is a quick video about primary sources versus all the other ones, including secondary, and how you can know if it's from the horse's mouth or not. Okay? So pause me, go watch that, and then come back here and we'll talk about it a little bit more. Welcome back. So something that happens is that we sometimes assume that anything that's not a primary resource is not a good source at all. And that's not the case, right? One of the biggest problems that everybody has with Wikipedia is that everybody can change it, which makes it not really a primary resource for very many things. It's typically a secondary resource citing the actual sources. This is really useful, though, because it means that when you don't know where else to look, you can go to Wikipedia, look for a concept, click on the little number above that information in the text, go down to the resources, see what that source is, follow it back to the horse's mouth. One of the great things about Wikipedia is that when it's working well, you can follow the sources. It gives you source material. You often cannot cite Wikipedia as a primary source, but it often hands you primary resources. And there are ways that Wikipedia could be a primary source. Can you think of how that would work? For what would Wikipedia be a primary source? If you were writing about Wikipedia, it would be a primary resource. If you wanted to describe the style of Wiki, or how encyclopedias have evolved, or what their take is on pop culture versus their take on scientific research, how they approach different topics in different ways, then Wikipedia would be primary. If you're talking about Wikipedia, it's primary, right? That said, you also have some unique resources as a student. The library and many of the other computers on campus, or one that you log into with your student ID, even if it's yours, you often have access to really amazing databases. And I encourage you to use these now because after you graduate, you won't have as many resources at your fingertips. Some of those sources cited in Wikipedia are subscription only. And right now, you have subscriptions to those databases. So it's not that everything in the database is reliable, it's that it's a really good deal to use this resource while you have it as a student. Because these databases of amazing information that you can evaluate are not always free. So check them out if you can while you're a student, either via the library or the library's page. If I can find a link, I will post it here. if I remember to after all these other sources. And then again, it varies by profession and field. What is primary? If you're talking about Birkenstocks, an advertising pamphlet would be a primary resource. An independent lab who checked to find out if the leather was real or not would be primary as well. So what is the horse's mouth varies a bit. And so that's why you have this handout that is primary versus secondary sources, so that you can start to suss out what I'm going to say about your sources when you present them. And also, if you can't find enough information about a source to do it in MLA format for a bibliography, that's a pretty good sign that it's not primary and not reliable. We'll get more to that in a minute. For example, in the sciences versus the humanities examples, scientific reports from peer-reviewed journals are primary, whereas for history or many versions of business, the primary resource is not a study of practices. It's the report about practices, either from the company itself or from someone who worked there or a person who was there. For example, a journal or an email is a primary source for something in the humanities or business, whereas a report, a scientific study, would work for biology or the economy. Someone who has studied something and cited their sources on their original research. If you go to original research and you like one of the ideas presented by the predecessor, someone who did that work before the document you're reading, and you find it in that document's sources, you need to shift gears and go to that source, right? So something that is itself well cited, if you like one of the concepts that it's citing instead of its concept itself, you have to dig beneath and go to that source. Always follow as far back to the horse's mouth as you can. As far as you can go with a source, dig back underneath. For Fred Smith, I couldn't talk to Fred himself. I didn't know him myself, so I wasn't a source. And his critics, right, art critics, who talked about him, were a primary source, not of the quality of his work, but they were a primary resource for how he was portrayed. If you are studying how websites portray a celebrity, then Wikipedia can be used, right? Then you don't have to follow Wikipedia's source back to the birth date of the person who saw the birth certificate of the celebrity. If you are talking about how information is presented about that celebrity, what is primary versus secondary shifts? Horse's mouth, it takes some practice. It takes a lot of practice. It's super frustrating, but the end result is that your presentations and proposals and research will be the strongest. If you can find the strongest sources with the strongest organizational method and the strongest thesis statement, you're going to nail everything. Your grant proposal, your proposal to do something at work, the meeting that you run, the topics that you debate in the meeting that you run, all of these things will magically start to come together when you find these ways to work with the information. Okay? And then above and beyond what's primary and secondary, you have to decide if it's reliable. And this has a lot of different levels. So there are multiple handouts on this, and you won't necessarily get the knack for it right away. It actually just takes practice. If you really want to go into technical writing or research, or if you're in a field that ends up referencing lots of research to help you decide what step you take next in your field. You will just learn to recognize immediately what some of the red flags are for reliable or not, or primary or not. So one of these that I really like is from Lee College, Emma Wood Carlson, and another one that I also really like is from Purdue OWL. Their online writing, what the L stands for? Things we don't know until we say them out loud. OWL, online writing what? That starts with L. They have some great guides about what is a reliable source or not, especially geared at presentations and writing papers. And you can transfer these pretty easily to anything that you have to run that manipulates information with sources. So first you need to find out who wrote it, right? If there's no author's name, is it the organization? Is it the company? Can you dig further and find who wrote it? Anonymous quotes, not reliable. If you can't find out who wrote it, if you can't attribute a piece of information, whether it's original research or just an off-the-cuff quote from a witness, not reliable. You got to know who wrote it. And then you can look at their extension, especially because we do so much online research these days. Unless you're physically in a book, which is amazing, or a paper journal or magazine, which would be amazing. You should look into those. Not everything available online. Look at the domain name. Is it .com? Is it .gov? Is it .org? Who is paying for this? And you have to, do some sleuthing. Finding the real facts, finding the real thesis statement, and finding the real sources for everything in life, not just presentations and papers, often takes some sleuthing and some digging to find out who wrote it, noticing what their domain name is, who's paying for something. Is this truly independent research from a grant? Who are they beholden to? Is it a board? Is it an employer? Is it a research facility? Is it the government? You actually have to figure out, where is the horse's mouth? Before you know if you're at the horse's mouth, you have to figure out where a mouth resides on a horse and really dig into that information. You should look at the date. For some things, giant data collection takes a few years, right? So sometimes we are relying on census information or public health information that can be almost a decade old, and that is just as fast as it can be collected and processed. For other things, you might want to get, for example, a candidate's quote from this year, not necessarily something from 2 years ago. If that's all that's available, if that's the last time they talked on that topic, sure, absolutely. But just start noticing where you are in the chronology of the source material for your thesis and outline. And whether or not they cite their own sources, right, tends to be indicative of how good is their information. If they can't tell you their source, if they're not citing it, it's not as reliable, right? This is why journalists get pressed so hard to give up their sources, is because it's not reliable if it's just some crazy person on a website ranting with no sources. At least when it's Wikipedia, you can follow the sources. So follow all the way back to the horse's mouth. And anybody who's talking about the horse's mouth that you want to look into, hey, if they sort all of their information by who else, like what other horses' mouths they've looked in, that's great. Someone who's citing their sources well is probably more reliable. And then there's also this concept of peer review. Peer-reviewed journals are many experts in the field looking into the quality of the study, trying to repeat the study, and reviewing everything about the research. And they're not necessarily always correct. But if a source is peer-reviewed, if a study is published in a journal that is peer-reviewed, if it is being discussed by a popular media outlet that is not peer-reviewed, These are the differences that you want to look for. Is this some crackpot who happens to have sources, but it's not really reviewed? Or is this something that, even if debatable in outcome, at least has the eyes and editors and hands on it of the other experts in that field? So look for things that are peer reviewed. And one of the things that those peer reviewers are looking for in a study are the statistics behind it. And even if you're going to talk about Birkenstocks and whether or not they're really made out of leather, you have to be able to interpret some basic statistics. And as much as I would like that to not be true, and as much as I learned this the hard way by getting a 5-credit C in my first statistics class, I can now let you know that the pain is worth it, and that you'll listen to the news in a completely different way, and read blogs in a completely different way once you've got some basic statistics. Once you can start to do even just the tip of the iceberg of what the peer reviewers are doing, you will suddenly have access to so much more research in life. And even without crunching the numbers yourself, without doing the actual math, even just discussing the way statistics work can be really helpful to your literacy as someone who wants to understand and or argue anything ever. So for example, when you hear a like a news show say, "Good news! Chocolate reduces your risk of heart attack," or "A glass of wine a day is good for your cholesterol." What do you do with that? So a couple things. One is you immediately have to check if they're using a primary resource. And then you have to track it back to the horse's mouth, find the study, and see if the study seems to be reliable. Did they cite things? Is it published in a peer review? Has it been repeated more than once? And then you have to analyze the study itself. If it gets that far, there may be some obvious no's before you get there. Okay, so we're going to dive a little bit into what the statistics of a study can reveal. Fun with statistics is the name of this handout, and I guarantee you it's only fun after you've started to figure it out. It becomes important to understand what statistics does and why we bother. And the reason that we bother is that before a scientist or researcher of almost any kind that does quantitative research that involves numbers and data, they define their hypothesis, their thesis statement, and then they set 2 conditions. This is what it will look like if my experiment or hypothesis is correct. This is what it will look like if my hypothesis is incorrect and fails. The line between those 2 categories of success and failure, of significance and insignificance, is set before they start the experiment. They say, if my data is in this category, success. If my data is in this category, fail. And the line between those 2 that determines significance, some kind of important variance from neutral, is statistics. Statistics is not just probability. It is not just probability. It is not just count the number of people who play the lottery and how many tickets you bought and putting it in a simple ratio. Statistics helps us determine, based on a line that is set before data is collected, what the results will mean, right? So in their most basic, they tell us, was there a significant effect of anything, or was there not significant, based on the line that was drawn for success before the experiment or research happened. And then it goes a bit deeper. In order to go into victory, in our study, we know that red wine reduced your risk of heart attack because we got significant results. They can't just do that. even if results are significant, in order to imply causation, that it was really the red wine that caused the decrease in heart attacks, that has to be the only variable. In that study, in that population, those people in that study could not have anything different other than their wine drinking habits. And that's having a control group. Do you think, actually have a control group for life, wherein one group drinks wine exactly like this and the other drinks none at all? And that's the only variable, that nobody in the zero wine group has anything else different. The only thing different they have, not their haircut, not their diet, not their exercise, not their access to a doctor. The only thing they have different is wine drinking. And the answer is no, of course not. That doesn't really happen. So the next time you hear a newscaster say, hey, good news, chocolate's good for you, pause, do your basic understanding of statistics and go, no way, there's no control group possible for that. And if there was a control group for that, if they found two sets of people who only had a difference in chocolate intake and had no other differences in life, how big do you think that sample size would be? Right? If it's only one or two people, it doesn't predict for the rest of the world. You have to have a big enough sample size for statistics to work appropriately. Now, this is a whole field, so we're only going to do the tip of the iceberg. But what's important about this is that when you're looking for sources for your proposal, for what policies work, for what marketing actually works, for what health benefits actually arise from certain other factors in life, you need to know if it's causation with a control group or if those significant results came with no control. If those significant results came with no control, it doesn't mean that the data is useless. It just means that there's a relationship between wine and heart attacks, maybe, that they tend to move in the same direction, or the exact opposite direction, that as wine intake increases, heart attack risk plummets, right? That could be a relationship that exists. It's not that it's not important, it's that we can't attribute one to the other because there could be a missing third factor, right? There could be a missing third factor, such as that everybody who buys red wine also tends to jog 5 miles a day. It could be that the jogging is causing the decrease in heart attacks, not the red wine. And if for some reason wine lovers also happen to love jogging, if it's the fashion, if it's a genetic preference of any variety, that is the third factor, could be jogging. And this happens a lot. So you need to immediately, for any source that you're thinking about using, even for Birkenstocks or evaluating the Olympics, you need to think about not just is this source primary and is it well cited, is it peer reviewed, but what is it really saying? If it is not saying that there was control group, you can only argue correlation, not causation. And I have 3 examples of this that I like to use because this happens a lot, even for really basic presentations and proposals. You can get yourself into really hot water by not knowing what a study is really saying. So here we go. Here are 3 examples that help illustrate what a missing third factor that points at only correlation can do to an argument. Okay, children who attend preschool show more aggressive behavior, such as stealing toys, pushing other children, and starting fights, than children who stay home. Does preschool cause aggression? And this happens in politics, in policy, in parenting, in real life. You have to ask yourself, oh my God, there's a correlation between going to preschool and being aggressive. does going to preschool cause aggression? Can you be aggressive at home with no siblings? Do you think that the third factor might be actually just exposure to social situations that even give the option for aggression? And the answer, of course, turns out to be yes, is that there is a third factor missing, and that is that you can't be super aggressive with multiple peers if you don't have access to multiple peers, right? So the third factor was possibility of aggression, of actually having a social situation in which to be aggressive. Okay, so it was only correlation that there were two factors, that attendance in preschool and aggression in social situations increased together, but what was really missing in the middle was that access to the social situation in which aggressiveness can arise. Okay, here's sample number 2. In impoverished countries, those who eat Spam have a lower incidence of cancer. Does Spam prevent cancer? And this really happened. In the Philippines, there was a measure of who was eating Spam and health outcomes, and one of the health outcomes that correlated really strongly with Spam was less cancer. Can you think of any third factors that would cause that? So as it turns out, in this sample, anyone who could afford Spam could also afford vegetables. So the vegetables were the missing third factor that did not originally show up in the data because it was a study of Spam. Spam did not prevent cancer. It just turned out that the third variable was vegetables, and that anybody who could afford Spam was also affording vegetables, which was actually preventing cancer. The third example, and maybe my favorite, is in World War II, soldiers with cloth hats reported drastically high numbers of head injuries. Tin helmets were handed out to soldiers, but the numbers of reported head injuries increased, right? So soldiers had cloth hats, and they were reporting lots of head injuries. So, oh shit, let's get something more protective. Tin helmets are added. But something we thought was going to be protective resulted in a drastic increase of head injuries. Why? Was it about the materials? Is something about tin causing head injuries? Like, is it clanging around in there like a bell? What's going on? Turns out that the tin helmets were much more effective than cloth hats. And what the data was showing was that instead of dying with a cloth hat on, soldiers were surviving, but with a head injury, right? So that third factor was not accounted for. That tin helmets going up at the same time as head injuries go up did not mean that the tin helmets were causing head injuries. It meant that the third factor was missing. That third factor happened to be that death rates were dropping. If death rates plummet, but they're surviving with an injury, it doesn't imply that the helmets are not effective. It's the exact opposite. So you really have to dive in there. So that's your task for this week, is to sit with how having a strong thesis statement and organizing high quality support for that thesis statement will almost always in life give you an amazing presentation and preparation, or papers if you do have to write research, not for this class, but for other things. That if you have a strong thesis statement and really great support, organized in a sensible way, half of that nervousness is going to disappear. So dive in there with some primary sources and organizing and thesis statements, and see what you can come up with. And I will talk to you again soon. Good luck with the tips of these icebergs. They're important ones.